The vice presidency, especially in its early days, was a notoriously inactive job, and perhaps no one hated this more than John Adams. He was an ambitious, opinionated, and argumentative man, and, as vice president, much of his job was to simply preside over the Senate and to be ready in the event a tragedy befell the president. Thomas Jefferson served as vice president to John Adams, who was his rival in the presidential election. This was the result of election rules at the time that made the candidate that received the second most votes vice president. In this role, Jefferson secretly worked to undermine the president's agenda. Aaron Burr was the only vice president who was actively wanted for murder. He killed his personal and political enemy Alexander Hamilton in a duel and subsequently went on the run. Jefferson, who Burr had served as vice president to, didn't in any way take Burr's side or try to shield him from consequences. Jefferson never liked or trusted Burr, and while Burr ultimately wasn't punished for the murder, his political career was ended, and Jefferson didn't run with him in the following election. George Clinton was the first vice president to serve under two different presidents. He served as Jefferson's second vice president and then served with James Madison. A former governor of New York, Clinton was very ambitious and sought to be Jefferson's successor to the presidency, but he ultimately settled for the vice presidency. Elbridge Gerry is the namesake of the political practice of gerrymandering, when the boundaries of electoral districts are redefined for the benefit of a political party or a candidate. While serving as governor of Massachusetts, Gerry had redefined the boundaries in a way that resembled a mythological salamander, hence the term, though the term uses a mispronunciation of his name. Daniel D. Tompkins is generally considered to be an ineffective vice president, even for the minimal duties he had. He rarely presided over the Senate and was out of Washington, D.C. through much of his tenure. By this point in his life, he'd slipped into alcoholism as a reaction to his bad financial situation. He'd spent much of his own personal wealth financing the military effort during the War of 1812, and his finances never recovered. John C. Calhoun was the second and only other vice president to serve under two different presidents. He served under two presidents of drastically different beliefs, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. This was due to unusual features of the time's political system. Calhoun was a bold, outspoken, and fierce politician in his own right, which led to him clashing and falling out with both Quincy Adams and Jackson. Martin Van Buren would be the last incumbent vice president to win the presidency himself for over 152 years. He was elected in 1836, and over a century later, George Bush was elected in 1988. Early in presidential history, some believed the vice presidency to be a stepping stone to the higher office. However, the years between Van Buren's and Bush's elections proved this didn't turn out to be the case. Richard Mentor Johnson had a common-law marriage to a biracial slave. The couple had two daughters, who Johnson formally accepted and allowed to have his surname. While his situation was accepted in his local area, it was controversial on a larger scale and negatively affected his political career. John Tyler was the first vice president to ascend to the presidency via the death of the sitting president. Tyler had only been vice president for 31 days. At the time, the rules for the vice president's role weren't clear, and some even argued that Tyler should only act as caretaker for the office until a special election to elect a new president could take place. Tyler, against much opposition, insisted that the vice president serve out the remainder of the presidential term, and it's perhaps only because of his insistence that the current system even exists. George M. Dallas is often remembered for putting President Polk's agenda, along with his duty as vice president, above his own political future. He once cast a tie-breaking vote in the Senate for a bill that reduced tariffs, which was widely unpopular in his home state of Pennsylvania. Since support for the bill came from multiple regions of the country, Dallas rationalized that on principle it should be passed. Though he received praise for his consistency and courage, he destroyed all future political prospects in his home state and never won an election there again. Millard Fillmore was promised a place on the presidential cabinet. The problem was that, at the time, unlike today, the vice president didn't generally attend cabinet meetings. However, President Zachary Taylor, a lifelong military man with no political experience, promised Fillmore the privilege genuinely, without knowing how the rules actually worked. The disappointed Fillmore had to reside to the same boredom other vice presidents were subjected to. William Rufus King was the only vice president sworn into office while on foreign soil. Sick with tuberculosis, King had traveled to Cuba in hopes that the temperature would aid his recovery. 2 days before his inauguration, Congress quickly passed a special act allowing for him to be sworn in without returning to the United States. King, however, wouldn't have much of a tenure, as he never recovered and died a month and a half after his term began. John C. Breckinridge was one of only 2 vice presidents to side with the Confederacy during the Civil War. As a Southerner from Kentucky, he sided with the secessionist movement in his state and served as a Confederate general. The only other vice president to side with the Confederacy was John Tyler. Hannibal Hamlin, Abraham Lincoln's original vice president, didn't know he was going to be replaced on the ticket when Lincoln ran for re-election. Hamlin was dropped from the ticket for political reasons. While he hated his inactive role as vice president, he was still disappointed to be dropped from the ticket and in the manner in which it was done. Andrew Johnson was a target in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. The original plot targeted both Johnson and Lincoln, along with General Ulysses S. Grant and Secretary of State William Seward. The assassination of Lincoln was the only assassination that took place. Had Johnson been killed, the presidency would have passed to the president pro tempore of the Senate. This was one of the few times in United States history the line of succession was almost evoked beyond the vice presidency. Vice President Schuyler Colfax and President Ulysses S. Grant formed the second youngest president-vice president pair in United States history. At the start of their terms, Grant was only 46 and Colfax 45. The only younger pair was Bill Clinton and Al Gore. Henry Wilson was one of 7 vice presidents who died in office. He'd suffered a stroke only 2 months after his tenure as vice president began, which caused paralysis in his face. He tried to carry on with his duties regardless. Sometimes he was able to preside over the Senate, but wasn't able to speak due to his declining health. 2.5 years after his first stroke, he suffered a final one, which killed him. As, at the time, there was no way for a new vice president to be assigned, the office remained vacant for the remainder of his term. When William Wheeler was sworn in as vice president, he was a recent widower and had no children. President Hayes and the First Lady were very sympathetic to the lonely vice president and took him into their social circle. He was a regular guest at White House luncheons and even traveled with the Hayes family on vacation. The relationship was uncommon, as most prior vice presidents either had distant or poor relationships with the president. Chester A. Arthur was only vice president for about 4 months before President James Garfield was shot by an assassin. Garfield laid bedridden for the next 2.5 months. Some pushed for Arthur to step up and assume the role of acting president, as Garfield was hardly working at full capacity. However, Arthur refused, as he didn't want to appear presumptive. Arthur was a very controversial figure and wanted to avoid any bad optics. Thomas A. Hendricks was nearly the Democratic vice presidential nominee 3 times in a row. He was first nominated in 1876. He and presidential candidate Samuel Tilden won the popular vote but lost the general election. In 1880, Democrats wanted to nominate him again, but he declined due to health reasons. In 1884, he was nominated alongside Grover Cleveland, and the ticket won the general election. Levi P. Morton served alongside President Benjamin Harrison. However, he didn't run with Harrison for re-election because of tension between the two. Harrison was trying to pass a bill through the Senate which would have allowed for federal oversight of congressional elections, with one of the purported goals to be securing the voting rights of African Americans. With a tied vote between supporters and opposers of the bill, many Republicans expected Morton to use his influence as presiding officer to aid the bill's passage. Morton refused to, and Harrison blamed him for the bill's failure to pass. Adlai Stevenson I, vice president to Grover Cleveland during his second term, was the grandfather of Adlai Stevenson II, who ran against Dwight D. Eisenhower twice for the presidency. Starting with Stevenson I, the family became prominent in Illinois state politics. Garrett Hobart was an exception to the norm of inconsequential vice presidents. He didn't simply treat his role as presiding officer in the Senate passively, but used it to push through President McKinley's agenda. He also regularly reported the Senate's activities to the president and the cabinet. One reporter said, quote, "For the first time in my recollection, and the last for that matter, the vice president was recognized as somebody, as a part of the administration, and as a part of the body over which he presided." Today, Theodore Roosevelt is remembered as one of the most iconic United States presidents, but he could have gone down in history as another forgotten vice president. Party bosses who were frustrated by his progressive agenda and his stubbornness had planned to render him completely ineffective by making him vice president. When McKinley was killed only months into his second term, one party boss exclaimed, quote, "Now we've got that damned cowboy as president." Charles W. Fairbanks was the first vice president who served a full term and didn't cast a tie-breaking vote. Vice presidents such as Tyler, Hendricks, and Roosevelt hadn't cast tie-breaking votes, but had also had their vice presidential tenures cut short. Since Fairbanks, only two other vice presidents have served a full term, or more than a full term, and not cast tie-breaking votes: Dan Quayle and Joe Biden. James S. Sherman died just a week before Election Day 1912. He was running for a second term alongside William Howard Taft. Another vice presidential candidate was quickly designated to receive the votes Sherman would have received, though it ultimately didn't matter as the Taft-Sherman ticket lost the election. Thomas R. Marshall was the first vice president in nearly a century to serve 2 full terms. Prior to him, the last had been Daniel D. Tompkins. There were many 2-term presidents between then, such as Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, and Grover Cleveland, but none had the same vice president for both of their terms. Marshall stayed vice president to Woodrow Wilson for 2 full terms, despite high tensions between the two men. Calvin Coolidge was the first vice president to attend regular cabinet meetings. Other vice presidents, going as far back as Adams, had attended some cabinet meetings, but even with Adams, it wasn't for the first part of his tenure. Even an influential vice president such as Hobart didn't attend cabinet meetings, or at least not regularly. Harding had invited Coolidge to cabinet meetings from the start, and Coolidge attended them, though he didn't speak much, not seeing it as the vice president's place. Charles G. Dawes is the only vice president credited with a #1 pop hit. As a self-taught pianist, flutist, and composer, he composed a piece called Melody in A Major. While it became popular in its original form, it received even more popularity after songwriter Carl Sigman added lyrics to the piece, creating a version called It's All in the Game. Many notable artists such as Elton John, Merle Haggard, and Isaac Hayes performed their own recordings of the song. A 1958 version, recorded by R&B singer Tommy Edwards, reached #1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. Charles Curtis was the first Native American to serve as vice president, and the first person of significant non-white ancestry to serve as either president or vice president. The only other Americans with this distinction are Barack Obama, a president, and Kamala Harris, a vice president. Prior to the vice presidency, Curtis served as Senate Majority Leader for 4 years, where he was again the first non-white to serve. John Nance Garner remains the longest-lived vice president in United States history. He died at age 98. In fact, he lived longer than all presidents, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, who lived to 100. Garner was 72 when he finished his second term as vice president. He returned to his home in Texas, expecting not to live much longer, only to live for another 26 years. Henry Wallace was controversially open to unconventional religious beliefs, such as mysticism and pantheism. This, along with some of his pro-Soviet statements and very liberal viewpoints, made him highly controversial. While Franklin Roosevelt favored him as a potential successor, the Democratic Party pressured him not to run with Wallace for his 1944 campaign. While Harry S. Truman was serving as vice president, he had no knowledge of the atomic bomb. Truman was only vice president for Roosevelt's fourth term, which lasted only 3 months. Furthermore, Truman was hardly a trusted confidant of Roosevelt's, like Henry Wallace was, and had been shut out of many important discussions. Shortly into Truman's presidency, he was told of the bombs, and 4 months later, he approved their use in combat. Alben Barkley was the first vice president to go by the shortened nickname for the vice president, Veep. In his autobiography, he credited the nickname to his 10-year-old grandson. Quote, "We were having a family conversation one night about what a tongue twister it was to be addressed as Mr. Vice President, and Stephen spoke up. Gramps, VP stands for Vice President. Why not stick in a couple of E's and call it Veep?" I mentioned this story at a press conference a week later, when some newspaper men were asking what they should call me. They printed it, and the name has stuck ever since. Richard Nixon remains the second youngest vice president in United States history. He was 40 years old when he took office. Even at a young age, he'd caught the attention of party leaders for his boldness in confronting suspected communists and for his political potential. The only vice president who was younger was John C. Breckinridge, who took office at just 36. Lyndon B. Johnson was frustrated through much of his vice presidency. In his previous position as Senate Majority Leader, he was one of the most powerful men in the country, but as vice president, he had much less influence. Johnson's initial efforts to have a larger role in the administration were dismantled by President Kennedy and other members of his party. He was given some responsibilities, such as oversight of the space program, but it was nothing close to the power he was used to. Hubert Humphrey ran in the 1968 presidential election against former Vice President Richard Nixon. This was one of only 2 times in the nation's history that the 2 main contenders for the presidency were men who'd served as vice president. The only other time was during the 1800 election, when Vice President Thomas Jefferson ran against former Vice President John Adams. Spiro Agnew is one of only 2 vice presidents to resign. His resignation came in the wake of a charge of tax evasion. The only other vice president to resign was John C. Calhoun, who did it so he could return to the Senate. Gerald Ford hadn't sought the vice presidency, much less the presidency, to which he eventually ascended. His longtime goal was to become Speaker of the House, but after Agnew resigned, Ford was the only Republican who Democrats agreed to confirm for the vice presidency, as he had good relations with both parties. Nelson Rockefeller was promised by President Gerald Ford to have an important role in his administration as a, quote, full partner in the presidency, especially in domestic policy. However, in office, Rockefeller felt he had little to no real power. This generally hasn't been attributed to malice on Ford's part, but rather to the will of other powerful figures in the Ford administration. Nevertheless, Rockefeller, a strong personality who'd run for the Republican nomination in past elections, was disappointed with his lack of influence. Walter Mondale was the first vice president to have an office in the White House. When offered the vice presidential nomination, he was weary about giving up his Senate seat for a largely ceremonial role, and required considerably more influence than previous vice presidents, including direct access to the president and access to classified documents. He was also the vice president who started the tradition of weekly lunches with the president, and is considered the first of the truly modern vice presidents. George Bush's good relationship with President Ronald Reagan largely came about because of an assassination attempt on Reagan. They'd competed against each other for the Republican nomination and were from different factions of the party. When Reagan was shot early in his presidency, Bush faced intense pressure to assume presidential power. Bush, however, was careful not to overstep his bounds, and even as he took on more duties while Reagan recovered, he he made sure to do so in a deferential way. It's often said that this situation is what truly strengthened the relationship between the two. Dan Quayle was infamous for his widely publicized gaffes, such as, quote, "I have made good judgments in the past. I have made good judgments in the future," and, quote, "One word sums up probably the responsibility of any vice president, and that one word is to be prepared." Other statements he made were simply strange, such as, quote, "I believe we are on an irreversible trend toward more freedom and democracy, but that could change." Quayle was only 41 when he took office, and his critics often attacked him as being too young to be ready for the presidency. His gaffes were prime material for their criticisms. Al Gore is one of 3 vice presidents to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Gore received the prize in 2007 for his part in making the documentary film An Inconvenient Truth. In particular, the press release said it was for his, quote, "efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change." The other 2 vice presidents to receive the award were Theodore Roosevelt and Charles G. Dawes. Dick Cheney was the only vice president who'd also served as Secretary of Defense. He'd served in this role during the administration of George Bush Sr. He is one of 5 vice presidents who'd previously served in cabinet positions, the others being Jefferson, Calhoun, Van Buren, and Wallace. Joe Biden was the first 2-term vice president to not cast a tie-breaking vote. The 2 other vice presidents with the least amount of tie-breaking votes were Tompkins and Garner. Tompkins was notably absent through many Senate sessions, and Garner had presided in a time when one party had a strong majority in the Senate. Biden generally presided over a time of Democratic Party dominance in the Senate, but it wasn't even close to the kind of Democratic dominance Garner had presided over. Yet Garner had still cast 3 tie-breaking votes. Some speculate that increased congressional partisanship is the reason for the lack of ties. Mike Pence was the first vice president in 50 years not to run with the president he'd previously served with. Pence ran for re-election alongside Donald Trump in 2020, but didn't run with him in 2024 due to a falling out between the two over Pence certifying the 2020 election results. It was the first time a vice president didn't run with the president he served with since Gerald Ford in 1976, who, when running for a second term, didn't run with Rockefeller. Kamala Harris was the first female vice president in United States history. She was the 3rd female vice presidential candidate for a major party. The first was Geraldine Ferraro, who ran with Walter Mondale in 1984. The second was Sarah Palin, who ran with John McCain in 2008. Harris's presidential run in 2024 made her the 2nd female presidential candidate for a major party, the first being Hillary Clinton in 2016. J.D. Vance is the first vice president to have facial hair in almost a century. Prior to Vance, the most recent was Charles Curtis, who left office in 1933. Curtis, however, only had a mustache. The last vice president to have a beard was Charles W. Fairbanks, who left office in 1909. But even Fairbanks only had a goatee rather than a full beard. While several United States presidents had full beards, Vance is actually the first in vice presidential history with this distinction. If you enjoyed this video, you can browse this channel for more videos on United States presidents, from George Washington to Donald Trump, discussing their careers, personal lives, and places in history.